That layering is exactly what preserves the twisted truth. Original, often pragmatic functions overlaid by mythic moralities that do terrible or beautiful things in the name of memory. Aries, the ram that rescues and demands a price. Imagine the narrow seaside village at dawn, the smell of pitch and salted fish, children climbing the low rock to see the first eastern light. In such places, the natural world and court politics were not separate arenas. The same threats that made harvest uncertain, floods, famine, hostile neighbors, also shaped the stories people told. The ram in Greek lore is Chrysomalos, the golden-fleeced ram whose wool glowed as if lit from within. Its best-known tale begins not with heroics, but with a stepmother's jealousy and a household arranged by fear. Aphamas, a king with misfortune at his back, marries a new woman. Two children, Phrixus and Helle, are favored by their birth mother. In many versions, the stepmother plots the children's death to secure her own son's inheritance. The means varies: a sacrificial altar, poisoned garments, engineered omens. In some tellings, the plot is explicit. In others, it is veiled as a courtly maneuver. The intervention comes in the form of a winged ram, sent, so the story says, by Hermes or by a cloud-formed Jupiter. The ram carries the children away across the sky. But the rescue is not unambiguously heroic. Helle falls from the ram as they cross a narrow strait. The place of her fall keeps her name, Hellespont, an etymological echo of loss. Phrixus survives and, in gratitude or under direction from his host, often named King Aeetes, kills the ram. Its hide becomes the golden fleece, an object whose future is not peaceful but political. The fleece is offered in sacrifice, or it becomes a prize to guard and contest. The very prize that later draws Jason and the Argonauts into a campaign of theft and alliance. So the ram offers salvation, but it costs a sister and converts mercy into an object of political value. The twist of Aries is that rescue may create new claims and new violence. The very act that spares one life enshrines a trophy that others will cross seas to take. Astronomically, the ram is a spring marker. In older Babylonian sources, there are fuzzy echoes of a ram-like figure tied to the vernal rise, the moment when days lengthen and communities begin to plant. The name Aries as the head of the zodiac is a Hellenic adoption of a longer Near Eastern tradition. How precisely the Greeks inherited the ram motif is indefinido in its particulars, but the functional logic is clear. A ram, emblem of fertility and wild unpredictable force, suitable to herald an agricultural cycle. For navigators, the ram's rising could anchor calendars. For poets, it became a memory palace for stories about sacrifice and succession. The ram's fleece, meanwhile, acquires its own life in the mythic economy. Sacred hide as a guarantee of kingship, as talisman, as catalytic object of quest. The moral grammar here is ambivalent. In mythic terms, the God-sent rescue affirms divine favor. In social terms, the rescue rearranges property and prestige. Sacrifice, once made, turns mercy into legitimacy. In some versions of the story, the ram is never fully thanked. The roadside burial of Helle is not remedied, and the fleece's new use silences mourning beneath ritual formalities. That silence is one of the little darknesses the sky preserves. Taurus, the bull that crosses a sea. Picture the eastern Mediterranean coast, low dunes, olive terraces, and the hush of a trader's harbor. Europa is a Phoenician princess. She gathers flowers by the shore. The god, attributed with desire, in these tales, does not come with an invitation. Zeus transforms himself, most famously, into a white bull, to carry Europa across the water to the island that will bear her name, and a dynastic future. Minos, who will later rule Crete, will claim descent from that union. Some tellings emphasize seduction, others acknowledgement of force. We must be careful with the language. In mythic shorthand, transformation is often a cloak for unequal power. A god's desire enacted as metamorphosis, a human's agency compromised. Ancient listeners may have read this differently than we do. Modern sensibilities demand we name the asymmetry. What is less ambiguous in the tale's consequences is the production of political foundation. Europa's crossing gives Minos, and through him the legend of the Cretan labyrinth and the Minotaur, a genealogical anchor. The bull, then, carries not only a woman, but a seed of future civic power. In later Greek and Roman reworkings, bulls play many roles. The Cretan bull, for instance, reappears as an object of Heracles' labors and as the sire of the Minotaur in alternate genealogies where Poseidon and human frailty combine to produce monstrous consequences. Across cultures, the bull is simultaneously fertility symbol and instrument of domination, the animal that tills the field and the beast that must be tamed for urban order. As constellation, Taurus marks the late spring to early summer sky in classical reckoning, an important time for herders and farmers. The Pleiades cluster embedded in Taurus was used as a practical marker for navigation and seasonal labor. The bright eye Aldebaran and the nearby russet hue of other stars were reference points for mariners tracing the coastline and for farmers timing sheep shearing and grape harvests. In Near Eastern star lists, older bull figures may have been associated with storms or seasonal floods. Some scholars see continuities between those precursors and the later Western bull. Where names and associations shift, mark them as indefinito. Cultural transmission is rarely a clean relay. The twist of Taurus is thus twofold. The bull is protector and conveyor of life, but its appearance in myth often masks coercion that founds civic power. Note how, in both the ram and the bull, a motif repeats: the animal as metonymy for rescue or desire, and the rescue/desire immediately creating political goods, dynasty, fleece, kingship, that themselves become causes of further conflict. The heavenly symbol simplifies the story into a compact image. On the ground, humans feel the messy consequences. Gemini, the twins who divide mortality and give a city its ritual heartbeat. Now imagine a coastal polis where ships come and go, and the harbor is a place of both trade and danger, where reputation, oath, and blood ties matter more than written law. Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, are the twin sons of Tyndareus and Leda in some tellings, and in others they have different parentage, with Zeus as a possible father. Another example where versions diverge and we say, in some stories, in others. The brothers personify a paradox. One is mortal, the other divine. When one twin dies, Castor in many versions, though the pair's death and resurrection cycles vary, Pollux refuses to accept eternal life alone and begs Zeus to share immortality. The result? Their stars are bound together. They become a single phenomenon in the heavens, and sailors come to pray to them for rescue. Their twinship becomes civic glue. Temples to the Dioscuri dot ports. Statues hold up the ideals of brotherhood, loyalty, and the expectation that the strong will not abandon the vulnerable. The twist is in the bitter bargain. One twin's death is necessary for the elevation of both to a celestial memorial. And the act of sharing immortality is framed as noble but also as a reallocation of death. The city gains a pair of divine patrons. Someone dies. The myth instructs civic duty. Sailors and soldiers are to stand by one another. Yet it also hides the cost of martial valor. The dead, the relatives left behind, the rituals that smooth grief into public display. There are multiple traditions around the twins. Some emphasize their role in the rescue of Helen of Troy. Others foreground equestrian or nautical cult acts. The Dioscuri's star cluster sits near Orion's shoulder, used by mariners to steady course. In some seafaring traditions, their rising and setting were read as weather signs. Linguistically, Gemini is a Roman label for twins, but the twin motif goes back far deeper.
Twin gods and hero pairs are near universal in Indo-European mythic repertoires and may reflect ancient social realities, paired leaders, dual cultic offices, or complementary crafts. The twins' moral economy, shared fate as exemplary virtue, was a useful ideological tool for communities dependent on mutual reliance, particularly those whose livelihoods were at sea or in warfare. 3 signs, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, cluster for a reason. They sit in the spring season of the solar year in tropical reckoning. Spring is emergence and mobility. Animals are mated, crops are planted, ships begin their long voyages after winter's lull.
The myths reflect that forward motion, but insist on an unsettling ledger. Growth and movement often require sacrifice, displacement, or the binding of bodies into political narratives. The sky becomes a curriculum, rehearsing again and again. Rescue can demand loss. Founding acts are rarely without a price. Devotion can both uplift and erase the dead. These first 3 constellations also illustrate a pattern of cultural sedimentation. A basic functional need, knowing when to plant, how to navigate, when to muster, gets overlaid with heroic stories that lent affect and moral teaching to otherwise dry astronomical data. As seasons turned and empires rose, myths accreted layers. The original agricultural omen becomes a tale about kings and heroes, then a civic cult, then a literary motif. Under every neat glyph, something messy is fossilized. If the ram, the bull, and the twins teach us about emergence, rescue, and divided mortality, the next group of signs turns us toward growth, its protection, and the fragile domestic virtues that keep a polis functioning. Consider the crab that no one expected to be remembered. Cancer, a small creature honored for a stubborn loyalty. Picture a parched summer slope above a marsh, where laborers drag a weary beast across scrubbed rock. Heracles, always unfinished tasks, always the next heavy lifting, comes down to fight a many-headed menace, the Hydra. Folklore is full of the motif of the giant hero and the small, perhaps ridiculous helper. The crab that joins the battle seems at first an absurdity. Why would a crustacean take on a serpent? In the common telling, Hera, who delights in vexing Heracles, sends a crab to distract and aggravate him. The crab bites, is crushed, and Hera crowns its loyalty by placing it among the stars as Cancer. The honor is almost comic, but also grim. The creature is tiny, its contribution is marginal, yet in mythic terms, loyalty, even when futile, merits memorial. There are variant tellings. Some say the crab was merely an obstacle, others that it intervened to save allies. The moral texture here is ambiguous. The crab's catasterism suggests a cultural impulse to commemorate even small acts when woven into the larger heroic tapestry. For sailors, the rising of Cancer had practical import, their summer course and the timing of coastal winds. And for farmers, the cluster marked midsummer constellations aligning with harvest timings for certain crops. The twist of Cancer is the valorization of marginal effort. The sky gives a place to an otherwise unremarked life, but that place is also a monument to failure, to a loyalty that did not change the outcome. It is a reminder that commemoration can sanctify futility as much as heroism. The story also shows how gods use minor actors as instruments of larger designs. Hera's crab is not noble, it is a pawn. Yet later audiences may remember the crab's bravery rather than Hera's instrumental cruelty. This is one of myth's moral tricks. Acts are reattributed by later listeners to produce comforting narratives about devotion and recognition, even as the operation that forced the devotion was manipulative. Leo, the roar of achievement that requires a mantle. Think of a hunting ground ringed by polis settlements. A lion is preying on flocks and disturbing the livelihoods that depend on sheep and goats. Heracles is sent to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide is invulnerable to weaponry.
He wrestles it, ends the beast's reign, and, in an act that is both pragmatic and symbolic, strips the lion to use its impenetrable hide as protective mantle. That skin becomes a badge of authority, a visible proof of a hero who has taken danger into himself and emerged wrapped in it. The lion story is a parable about mastery and appropriation. The hero's victory is also an act of consuming the other. The beast's skin becomes a garment, its ferocity turned into a tool that secures the hero's position. The twist is this conversion of raw force into institutional power. The wearer is protected by the animal's potency, and the skin communicates a social message. He has authority. He has been where others could not go. But note the cost. To be wrapped in that skin is also to be marked by violence. The lion's ferocity is now integrated into the city's visual language of power. Regulus, a bright star often associated with royal or kingly signification, sits nearby in Leo, its name meaning little king in Latin, and serves as an astronomical complement to the theme of earned rule. Variants place the lion in different relational contexts. Sometimes the beast is a monster of chaos, sometimes a local problem, sometimes a more allegorical force. In some earlier Near Eastern typologies, the lion is a common symbol of kingship or wild danger. The Greek narrative tweaks that symbolism toward an ethic of heroic struggle that legitimates later political structures. Navigationally, Leo's appearance cues midsummer activities and was used as one of many reference markers by sailors working the eastern Mediterranean. The lion's mantle thus becomes civic dress, and the story of how the mantle was earned is the city's claim to justified authority. These sections, Cancer and Leo, push the theme from emergence into the height of action, protection, appropriation, the domestication of dangerous force. The myths tell of small loyalty and of the hero's mantle. They also suggest a moral calculus. To protect is sometimes to consume. To commemorate is sometimes to soften cruelty into valor. Virgo, the maidens who witness and the ear of wheat that testifies. Imagine early autumn, the threshing floor dusted with chaff, women moving rhythmically with flails, the smell of grain and smoke. The figure associated with Virgo is not a single stable person across all sources. In some tellings, she is Astraea, a virgin goddess of justice who walks the earth among humans until human wickedness drives her away, leaving behind the memory of a more just age. In other traditions, the earth goddess Demeter and the rhythms of grain and domestic order fills the constellation's shadow. The symbolic field is broad: harvest, purity, civic testimony. The twist of Virgo surfaces in the interruption of abundance by human failing. If Astraea departs at the advent of human injustice, Virgo becomes a celestial complaint. The world has declined, and the goddess's withdrawal is both accusation and mourning. Where Demeter dominates the field, the story is about deprivation and restoration, Persephone's descent and the resulting barrenness. Yet the Virgo motif often foregrounds the quiet domestic arts, law, witness, the practices that keep communal life functioning. The ear of wheat as a recurring motif gives Virgo a practical agricultural reading. This constellation's rising and setting were important for harvest calendars. The image of the maiden holding grain is not sentimental, it is pedagogical. The goddess's disappearance or suffering dramatizes the stakes of civic negligence. Etymologically, the Latin Virgo means a maiden, but the constellation's antecedents may include older Near Eastern fertility figures or goddesses associated with grain. Some of these parallels are indefinable in their direct lines of transmission, but the functional alignment, harvest sign meets goddess of domestic order, is consistent. The modern simplification of Virgo as a tidy, chastened personality trait omits the ancient anxieties about scarcity, justice, and the civic responsibility that keeps stores full and laws enforced. Libra, a set of scales that was not always its own sign. If you look at classical sources, Libra as a zodiacal glyph is a later Hellenic Roman insertion. In earlier star catalogs, the balance of Libra is sometimes read as the claws of Scorpius folded across the celestial ecliptic. In Roman times, however, the scales come to represent justice, balance, and civic measure, ideas often personified by the goddess Equitas. In an imperial context, the scales are an emblem of legal fairness, taxation, and the calibration of civic life. The twist for Libra is that balance is simultaneously a technical tool and an ideological project. Scales measure grain, gold, and the value of exchange. They make fair trade possible and serve as a practical instrument for merchants and magistrates. But they also become symbols for moral balance, a public project of the state to lecture citizens about equilibrium between private advantage and public good. In that migration from practical object to moral emblem, something gets lost. The rough, often corrupt human negotiations that use scales are smoothed into an idea of impartial justice. Libra, a set of scales that was not always its own sign. If you look at classical sources, Libra as a zodiacal glyph is a later Hellenic Roman insertion. In earlier star catalogs, the balance of Libra is sometimes read as the claws of Scorpius, folded across the celestial ecliptic. In Roman times, however, the scales come to represent justice, balance, and civic measure, ideas often personified by the goddess Equitas. In an imperial context, the scales are an emblem of legal fairness, taxation, and the calibration of civic life. The twist for Libra is that balance is simultaneously a technical tool and an ideological project. Scales measure grain, gold, and the value of exchange. They make fair trade possible and serve as a practical instrument for merchants and magistrates. But they also become symbols for moral balance, a public project of the state to lecture citizens about equilibrium between private advantage and public good. In that migration from practical object to moral emblem, something gets lost. The rough, often corrupt human negotiations that use scales are smoothed into an idea of impartial justice.
At sea and in markets, the moment when a result is balanced is often the result of power, bargaining, and enforcement, not a neutral arithmetic. Where Libra was partly a reconfiguration of Scorpius' influence, the Roman civic reinterpretation is instructive. The same stars can be read as both cautionary prompt, beware the scorpion sting, and regulatory ideal, achieve balance. Scorpio, the hunter's limit and the seasonal counterstrike. The scorpion in myth is most famous for its enmity with Orion. Versions vary. One says Orion was boastful, chasing every creature and claiming mastery over animals. Another suggests he was hunting companion to Artemis. In some accounts, the scorpion is sent by Gaia or Artemis to curb Orion's hubris. The scorpion delivers a lethal sting. Orion dies or is incapacitated. Both are set in stars so that neither will forget the moment of their confrontation. Antares, a ruddy star in Scorpio, carries a name that sounds like anti-Aries, a martial echo. Yet the connection between the star's identity and the mythic scorpion reveals a cosmological warning. Pride finds a small counter. The scorpion's seasonal function is cautionary. As autumn encroaches and the sea changes its temper, the scorpion's rising and setting signaled shifts in climate or migratory patterns of animals. Farmers read it as a sign to change practice. Sailors read it as a nod to shifting winds. The twist here is literal. A small creature has the capacity to bring down the great hunter. Myth thus encodes a social humbling. Even the most powerful are bounded. This moral is civic pedagogy, an instruction against hubris disguised as bedtime story. Between these next three signs, we reach the valley of harvest and the turning toward the slow contraction of the year. From Virgo to Scorpio, the narrative tightens. Abundance must be defended, balance must be kept, pride will be checked. The sky, acting as a communal memory, rehearses these constraints across seasons so that practical necessity and moral teaching are inseparable. Farmers, sailors, magistrates, each reads the same stars for different immediate ends. But the myths provide a shared vocabulary for understanding risk and responsibility.
We have now moved through spring's first sproutings and summer's full hum. The next constellations carry us through autumn's reckoning and toward winter's long inwardness. The tales will remain dramatic, and each small twist will continue to complicate the neat symbols we think we know. The ram that saved a child, the bull that carried a princess, the twins who split mortality, all of them leave behind a pattern. Celestial images are compressed human archives, clean icons glossing messy human consequences. The sky preserves the ledger, it does not tidy its entries. Sagittarius, the archer who is both teacher and wound.
Imagine an upland camp in late autumn. Smoke from hearths hanging low over slate roofs, the smell of drying herbs, the sky a pale bowl where the Milky Way begins to smear itself from horizon to horizon. Hunters wind their bows more carefully now. The days shorten, prey thins, and the skills that keep a band fed are being counted and taught. In the star field that will become Sagittarius, there sits an ambivalent figure, an archer with the hindquarters of a beast, a being that is at once guide and reminder. Classical sources offer different names and emphases. The Roman star lists often speak of Sagittarius as a centaur archer. Greek myth supplies two prominent centaural figures who fold into the constellation's history, Crotus and Chiron, each carrying a different moral script. Chiron is the older, gentler tradition, a tutor, a physician to heroes, a repository of skilled restraint. He is a teacher of Achilles, of Jason, of none of the brutal excesses we often attribute to his kin. Chiron is a centaur of mixed genealogies, quoted as wise but wounded by the ways of the world. Mortals hurt him with an arrow coated in poisoned fate, and in some versions he voluntarily gives up his immortality to escape pain or to allow Prometheus to be freed. The centaur's archery is therefore laden. He teaches how to aim, how to measure force, and then becomes the example of how knowledge itself can be the site of injury. In other tellings, however, Sagittarius aligns with Crotus, an attendant of the Muses, a half-humorous figure who crafts archery and performance into civic amusement and ritual. Crotus's celestial rise is sometimes cast as a reward for skill and artistic bravery. There is, through both figures, a recurring twist. Archery, the skill that saves the hunt, also launches the arrow that will not return. The very art that secures livelihood is the art that causes permanent wound. In some versions of Chiron's tale, he is struck by Heracles' poisoned shaft, an accidental injury that nonetheless seals his fate. In other accounts, Chiron elects to die, and thereby instructs humans in the relationship between mortality and pedagogy. Even teachers are bounded, even wisdom has an expiry. Astronomically, Sagittarius crowns a portion of sky thick with the galactic center, a place where the Milky Way is densest, where navigation becomes less about single bright stars and more about a luminous river. For ancient mariners and shepherds, that luminosity denoted a particular time in the year associated with the end of harvest and the gathering of flocks. In Mediterranean agricultural calendars, the archer's appearance was sewn to late autumn signals, winds shifting, the smell of sap pulled back into trunks, the last migrations of wild boar. Zodiacal lore therefore maps practical cycles onto moral ones. Learn your craft and yet accept the limits it imposes. Cultural layering complicates the constellation. Some Near Eastern star lists had a figure of a man with bow and arrow in a similar region. Babylonian names may have designated a hunter or a wise figure that the Greeks later merged with their centaur myths. These are indefinito in their precise transmissions. How much was borrowed, how much was reinterpreted locally, but the pattern is clear. The sky holds a portfolio of archery and boundary, and cultures keep knitting local meanings into that cosmic garment. The archer's twist also enters political life. In polis rhetoric, the archer as teacher models the ideal magistrate, skilled, discerning, capable of launching measures that restrain error, yet vulnerable to the consequences of overreach. The cultural lesson is not just domestic, it is civic. A city can celebrate a public instructor, but it should also be careful how it places authority in bodies that can both shape and harm. If you follow the imagery, the motif repeats in quieter registers: the bow as instrument, the knot as memory. Sagittarian tales are less about a single dramatic theft or abduction and more about the delicate alignment between technique and fate. They remind communities that the arts they value have shadows, that a craft's power will at some point be turned inward, or at least invite injury. The centaur teaches, the archer wounds. That is the instruction the sky hands down. Scorpio and Sagittarius touch at a seasonal hinge. As the scorpion's sting warns, so the archer's aim must be precise. Autumn's decrescendo requires both caution and practiced release. The trio of Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius thus composes a small curriculum for civic maturity. Calibrate weight, check pride, and then, only then, let the arrow fly. Capricorn, the sea goat whose body remembers several waters. Picture now an early winter shore where fishermen mend nets under overcast light, and goats huddle on rocky terraces that slope toward a sea that sometimes breeds storms. The silhouette of a composite creature, front legs of goat, rear of fishtail, speaks of two worlds stitched together: mountain and sea, pasture and navigation, dry storage and flood. Capricorn's genealogy in the Greek imagination has multiple ancestral threads. One account connects the sign to Pan, who assumes a fish-tailed form when he leaps into a river to escape Typhon, a monstrous kernel of chaos. Another variant attributes the sea-goat motif to Amalthea, the nurse goat of Zeus, whose horn is associated with abundance and horned giving. Yet a third set of echoes reaches back toward Babylonian figures, half-goat, half-fish entities that inhabit primeval waters in older Mesopotamian cosmologies. Where the line is precise is indefinito. What matters is how the image speaks to a city that must manage both stored goods and seasonal inundations. The Capricorn twist is its hybridity. A creature designed to thrive in contradictions becomes a symbol for economies that depend on both stability and fluidity. In mythic terms, the animal offers rescue. Pan's transformation is a self-preserving trick that spares his life, but that survival is wrapped in awkwardness. The goat's horns and the fish's tail are not a smooth synthesis. They are a reminder that adaptability is often an ungainly compromise. For rulers and magistrates, Capricorn's meaning was useful. Think of long-term provisioning, the measurement of grain across winter months, the management of herds and ships at once. Capricorn season tends to coincide with the year's contraction. Stores must be protected, contracts enforced, debts managed. The sea-goat thus becomes a tutelary figure of thrift, of endurance, and of the uneasy bargains a community makes to survive the lean months. There is also a darker current. In some mythic cycles, the sea-goat is involved in larger cosmological struggles: Typhon's rampage, the fracturing of order. So the sign also points at contingency. When cosmic or natural disorder comes, the creature that straddles worlds is among the few who can navigate the wreckage. That is an enviable trait until you notice the cost. Boundaries blurred, identity stretched thin, and the creature's personhood reduced to a practical emblem. The sea-goat is honored for its usefulness, but seldom asked what the hybrid existence costs it. Astronomically, Capricornus sits near the winter solstice mark in classical calendars. Its heliacal rising or setting was used in agrarian scheduling for the cold months, when certain trades shut down, when wood needed to be stockpiled, when captains planned the slowest legs of trade. In Babylonian star lists, the figure that later becomes Capricornus may correlate with marine or seasonal water motifs tied to a god of fresh water. But the map from Mesopotamia to Hellenic forms is patchy and often indefinable. What we can say with confidence is that the constellation was useful in various ways: as a seasonal calendar, as a navigational reference for mariners hugging coastlines in the Mediterranean winter, and as an emblem of the uneasy marriage between domestic economy and the sea's generosity. Capricorn's modern echoes, discipline, austerity, are not wrong. They simply flatten the richness.
The ancient sign taught a public lesson in endurance and organization, but that lesson was taught through an image that itself testifies to compromise. To survive, you must be both goat and fish, land and water, animal and artifact. Aquarius, the water-bearer, a youth and the politics of pouring. Move inland from the sea to a river port, where the winter rains are swelling channels and the city's cisterns spill over into public squares. A boy with a jar becomes the constellation here, a figure whose story the Greeks and Romans traced to Ganymede, in one dominant but not exclusive tradition. Ganymede, often described as a Trojan youth of remarkable beauty, is taken to Olympus by Zeus, sometimes by an eagle sent as a divine agent.
The classical telling is careful and troubling in equal measure. One strand emphasizes honor. The boy is elevated to cupbearer to the gods, a position of trust that grants him immortality and a place in the divine household. Another strand, less sentimental and more ethically foregrounded, highlights the abduction's coercive mechanics. A powerful god removes a youth from his home, reshaping familial and political landscapes in one gesture. Ancient audiences themselves seem to have held both attitudes, one part ritual homage, one part acknowledgement of divine asymmetry. When we speak of Ganymede and the water-bearer more broadly, we must also remember that other cultures had water-bearer images located in roughly the same quadrant. In Mesopotamia, the god Enki, Ea, is associated with life-giving waters, with godheads who pour out rivers or wisdom. Those pre-Greek images might feed into the later figure, or they might reflect parallel religious needs. Someone must pour, someone must manage the distribution of life. The Greek absorption of the motif often conflates the civic with the eroticized. Roman iterations recast the pouring as an image of generosity, of governance that administers resources to the public good. All of these layers matter. The Aquarius twist is political as much as mythic. Water is a life resource but also a means of control. To bear water is to have custodial authority. Who has access? Who decides distribution? Who is elevated and who is left behind? The story of the abducted cupbearer quietly maps onto anxieties about elite appropriation. A city that celebrates a youth carried away to Olympus may be commemorating both generous bestowal and the naturalized violence of power that can take young labor or talent away to serve elite households. In some civic cults, the pouring of libations by an honored youth becomes an institutional ceremony. In others, the water-bearer's depiction is used to justify patronage networks. Astronomically, Aquarius occupies a watery band of the sky. It brushes the ecliptic and sits among faint stars that ancient observers used to track seasonal moisture patterns. In practical terms, its rising and setting could indicate dry or rainy periods depending on local latitude and the calendar in use. Babylonian flood myths and star lists had watery constellations that may be ancestral to the later Aquarius image. Whether the Greek figure is a direct borrowing, a reinterpretation, or an independent invention built on common ecological concerns is indefinable. What is not ambiguous is how useful a water-bearer was to societies that must manage irrigation, cisterns, and public provision. Aquarius also carries a cultural ambiguity. In art and festival, the water-bearer may symbolize abundance and civic blessing. In subtext, he marks the moment when the community's best young are drawn into service of gods or elites. The myth thus nests benevolence with extraction.
The jar pours life, but its pourers are often taken. Pisces, the two fish bound by a cord, a pair that flees and binds. Finally, envision a late winter estuary where the air still tastes of ice, and the first intimations of thaw make people mutter hopes about seed. In the classical account attached to Pisces, two fish carry a woman and her companion across waters, saving them from a monster or from a pursuing deity. The canonical version makes the actors Aphrodite, or Venus, and her child Eros. When a great danger, sometimes Typhon again, threatens, the pair leap into the water to escape,
and the fishes bear them away, their tails sometimes tied together with a rope to ensure they do not lose each other in the current. The image is poignant: escape by binding, rescue via dependence. There are variations. Some tellings make both figures mortal maidens who are transformed. Others connect the pair to local Near Eastern fish deities, or myths of sacred fish that saved heroes. The motif of two creatures joined by a cord appears in several cultural repertoires and may predate the Greco-Roman codification. It persists because it literalizes a human truth. Survival often requires being tethered to someone else. The Piscean twist is both tender and tragic. The two fish save and bind. Their very survival runs counter to an ideal of autonomy. In agricultural terms, Pisces sits near the vernal equinox in classical tropical reckoning, or at least it once did. So the constellation becomes entangled with ideas of rebirth and of the tide that shifts toward planting. In some astrological ages talk, a modern layer of interpretation that belongs to later centuries, Pisces stands for a time of faith and devotion. Historically, however, the star pair signified practical moments for fishermen and estuarial communities: when to set nets, when to expect migrating shoals, when tidal rivers would ease navigation. If the fishes are connected to Aphrodite and Eros, the myth adds a moral layer: love as saving, love as binding. If they stem from earlier Mesopotamian myths of fish deities, the motif argues for a continuity of aquatic concern across millennia. Here, too, the theme recurs: rescue has a cost. The cord that ties the fish is also a rope that secures loss, memory, and obligation. Later poets would read the image as allegory for human love, inseparable, intimate. But the older practical layer insists on something cruder and more urgent. Two lives multiplied have a better chance to survive the river's violence than one alone. The gods' interventions, if gods intervene, are less about romance than about the necessities of communal continuity. A short interlude: autumn's taught lessons and winter's ledger. Each triad closes like a chapter in a civic manual. The first tells you to get moving with care and to remember that rescue can cost dearly. The second insists on protection and the domestication of force. The third trains you to calibrate pride and then to aim true. The fourth, just concluded, asks you to steward stores, to pour wisely, and to trust another to be bound. These are not moral platitudes, but survival protocols reimagined as stories. Embedded within each tale is practical guidance: when to plant, when to harvest, when to sail, when to hold back. And moral instruction: who does the work deserving of a place among the stars? What kinds of governance can be justified by victory? And how communities invent narratives to integrate loss into public memory. The sky, in other words, is both calendar and court, a ledger of what a people needs to remember. That ledger is not unbiased. It selects, narrates, and cleanses. It keeps the names that a community chooses to make exemplary and, through catasterism, stabilizes those choices in a visible, nightly archive. Epilogue: the zodiac as civic memory palace. If you stand again on that hill at night, if you return to the opening image with the cold iron of different seasons within you, you see what the zodiac asks of us. It does not merely hand down symbols to be stamped on rings or kids' notebooks. Each glyph is a palimpsest, an agricultural hint overlaid with heroic drama, a navigational marker overwritten by city politics, a devotional image softened into a morality tale. The twisted truths we sought are not scandalous revelations so much as the ordinary moral contortions of a species trying to teach itself what matters. Take one more passage through the catalog to see how this works at scale. The ram rescues and thereby makes new property, an altar, a fleece, to be contested. The bull abducts and produces lineage, the theatrical foundation of dynasties.
The twins demonstrate shared mortality as a civic virtue that smooths grief into ritual. The crab memorializes marginal loyalty, the lion's hide becomes institutional insignia, the maiden figures hold up domestic virtues with a sigh. The scales transmogrify practical measurement into an emblem of impartial governance. The scorpion reminds the proud that limits bite. The archer trains technique while harboring the possibility of wound. The sea-goat teaches endurance through awkward hybridity. The water-bearer presents both generosity and the politics of resource distribution. The fish bind escape to dependence, complicating the romance of salvation. These are grim, admirable lessons in equal measure. They are grim because they ask communities to accept that life's continuities often require someone's loss, that the artifacts of salvation become the instruments of later contest, that authority is often legitimated by violence recast as right.
They are admirable because they show how humans used imagination to encode survival strategies into stories, the mind's expedient way of transmitting the practical through the beautiful. Myth thus both informs and obscures. It conveys essential information, when to plant, whom to fear, and dresses that information in the colors of honor, shame, and memory. On method, how to read these constellations without sentimentality. A few practical tools help us read this archive responsibly. First, attend to the function before the flourish. Most constellations begin as calendars or as navigational fixings. Their later mythic decorations are often pedagogical. Second, watch for cultural accretion. Babylonian, Phoenician, Anatolian, and later Roman layers interact. Where precise lines of transmission are thin, mark them as indefinito and resist the temptation to invent clean filiation. Third, recognize the civic motive. These stories are not only entertainment. They are ways of training communities, soldiers, sailors, magistrates, and housewives in the skills necessary for continuity. Fourth, do not assume modern categories of consent or personhood neatly translate into ancient frameworks. Where abduction or coercion occurs, present it analytically with attention to power dynamics, not to titillate, but to understand the social logic that allowed such tales to function as exempla. And finally, resist reading these myths as political manifestos of singular truth. They are plural archives. At any given constellation, you will find contradictory tales. Sometimes a god is generous, sometimes predatory. Sometimes a hero is lauded, sometimes reduced. Those contradictions are not errors, they are features. They reveal that the societies who told these stories were wrestling with persistent problems, not all of which have comfortable resolutions. A last image: the knot, the mantle, the cord. Throughout this tour, I have returned to a small set of images: the knot, the mantle, the cord, because they recur and because they perform a moral function. The knot binds lovers or fish to ensure survival. It is as intimate as it is instrumental. The mantle covers a hero and marks authority. It is as much a tool as a trophy. The cord ties animals together for a communal purpose. It is as domestic as it is cosmological. When you wear a zodiacal sign today, as a pendant, as ink, as decorative vanity, remember that you are wearing one of those images. And that image remembers complicated histories of rescue and debt, generosity and coercion, pedagogy and pain. We live in an age that likes tidy icons. The market will sell you an archetype suited to your personality. Bracelets and blogs will compress millennia into a line of traits. That is commerce, and it has its uses. Identity is a marketable comfort. But if you want depth, if you want the sky to act as what scholars sometimes call a memory palace, then look up without settling for shorthand. Ask what a symbol once taught a community about timing, about who does the work of survival, and about how a city remembered those who were lost or elevated. Ask also what privileges allowed certain actors to be memorialized and others to be erased. In asking these questions, you use the zodiac for what it was first designed to be, an instrument of civic recall. Closing. An invitation under the old map. On clear nights, the sky still keeps these compact dramas. It does not judge by our modern ethics nor refuse them. It preserves. The stars are patient archivists. They hold the ram's fleece. They anchor the bull's crossing. They keep the twins' shared immortality. They host the crab's small memorial. They preserve the lion's mantle and the maiden's empty threshing floor. They balance grain on scales. They register scorpion's sting. They trace the archer's bow. They show the hybrid by the key. They carry the jar's pour. They tie two small fishes with a cord and watch them go. If this catalog of twisted truths has left you with questions about a single sign, about a mythic variant, or about how ancient calendars actually worked, tell us below which constellation you want unpacked next. There are deeper dives to be had. The Golden Fleece itself deserves a careful political reading, as does the cultic role of the Dioscuri in port cities. If you'd like to follow that path, subscribe and watch the next video in this series, where we will track one emblem across sources and centuries until its edges are no longer tidy. For now, step away from the tiny glyph and let the story spread. On a hilltop, with the cold air of winter or the warm hush of summer, the ancient atlas is still legible if you have patience. The zodiac is not a book of instructions for the self. It is a communal ledger. Read it with attention, and you will find that each sign keeps a small, often uncomfortable truth. The ways we survive are never as simple as the symbols we make out of them.